Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. As you can see on my screen, today we're going to be talking about judging an Oktoberfest beer. And this is a bit of a multifaceted look at what goes into Marzen and Festbier. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Christian Mercado, and I am a MPS student in food science and technology. All right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go a little bit over history, not to drain it too much because Austin has done a great job at that part. Then we will be talking about the perspective of various brewmasters on these two styles of beer. And then we're going to look at the actual profiles of how BJCP standardizes or defines Marzen and Festbier. And don't worry about the acronyms, I'll explain them later. And finally, we're going to be talking about food pairings for Marzen and Festbier. So first, let's open the Festbier, which is the Hofbrau Oktoberfest beer. This one. I know the picture is not quite clear, but I was trying to be consistent with the other folks and using the same source for the ratings. As you pour it, unmute yourself and tell me what you think about it.
I like this one a lot. It has a very clean flavor, but little malty. It's really nice.
Yeah, this one's very drinkable. Like, you could definitely go to a beer garden and drink a lot of this.
And I want you to think about those same descriptors that you're using right now, because when we get to the official description for the beer, I want you to see if you can match what you experienced there in this beer with what it's supposed to taste like.
I'm gonna think this was 6.3%. This tastes a lot later.
Yes. Austin, is this one of those that you can have 4,000 off?
Maybe just 400.
So
I think this one I think feels like the softest in your mouth of all the ones. Like it's almost like pillowy, but still light.
That's a great description. All right, so why don't we, while you start enjoying this beer and think about what it looks like, what does it smell like, what does it taste like, and for those of you who have more advanced palates, try to find that reminiscence of what does it have that it reminds you of. But in the meantime, we're going to talk about history. So, the history of beer is really long, but the beer as we know it really starts taking shape after the Reinheitsgebot law was put into place in Bavaria to control the ingredients that went into it, but also the price, the markup, and also it had punishment for those people who didn't actually follow the law, which was taking away their barrels. Something interesting that happened there was that they forbid to making beer between April 24 and September 28. And like Austin mentioned before, that's where the lagering process and leaving those beers for a long time to age really developed. So we have about 300 years from that point until the marriage of Ludwig and Therese, right? And that is a very long brewing tradition if you think about it from a time perspective, right? We haven't even had 300 years since that point when Oktoberfest started and now. So relatively speaking, they've been brewing for a long time. But let's just focus more of into what happens after the technology of indirect kilning happened, right? So indirect kilning is really a way to roast the barley, the malts, that was initially developed in England, and that, according to one of my sources, it was actually a piece of industrial espionage that the Germans actually stole the technology from the British and brought it in order to make paler malts. So if you think about roasting malts, think about how hatch chiles are roasted nowadays when you go to Wegmans, right? They have this this big drum, and then they just fire it and then they roast it. But in direct kilning has essentially a fire and then a chamber inside, and then within that chamber, that's where you actually kiln the malts. So it allowed for a really slow kilning, and you could have a better control of the color of the malt. So after that, in 1841, Spaten Brewery was the first brewery that actually named a beer Marzen beer. So the term of Marzen beer really starts at that point. And a couple of years later, and by couple I mean like 30, Cartland was the person that invented refrigeration. And at that point, we can see a transformation because we no longer depend just on that underground aging of the beer in caves, because we now have a way to control the fermentation temperature. So that was a full game changer. So from there to now, what has happened? Well, essentially in 1977, Michael Jackson came into the world, or not the Michael Jackson that you're thinking about, really the beer writer named Michael Jackson. And he made a book, he wrote a book called The World Guide to Beer. And essentially what he did was he categorized beer style, which was not something that was necessarily done at the time, but he traveled and he categorized beers by region, and he, in his very poetic way, described each of the characteristics of these beers. That actually gave the inspiration for creating what is known as the BJCP, or the Beer Judge Certification Program, which really aims to educate people about beer styles. But other than that, it's really an entity that writes down what beers should taste like, and then we use those descriptions to compete. And another data point here that I find very interesting is that it was in 1990 that Festbier became the official beer of the Oktoberfest. So it is since then that we've had the yellow fizzy Festbier, like the one that we're having right now, versus the more amber colored one. So in this process, I decided to call a couple different brewmasters from different locations to gather what their idea and what their approach is to making Marzen and Festbier. The guy that you see on screen right now, his name is Juan Cruz. He's from a brewery in Puerto Rico called Cirque, and he's had a very strong German inspiration for his beers, because that's where he draws a lot of the styles. And sorry for that. And the motto of his company is pan líquido, or liquid bread, or there's actually a word in German, flüssiges Brot, which means the same thing, liquid bread. And that is the best description that he says that he can come up with for what this beer should be like. This should be like actually drinking bread. From my notes on my meeting with him, these are the things that I feel that are crucial for defining these styles. So first off, that the pale malt was a game changer for the fest beer that you're having right now. So think about this: before the kilning technology existed, every beer was either black or shades of brown. The other thing is that when he's actually building a recipe for fest beer, he approaches it like almost a Helles. And maybe some of the malts change a little bit, some of the hops change a little bit, but this is something that came up in most of my conversations with brewers. All of them actually say that fest beer, it's almost Helles. From his perspective, creating this flavor is about using German ingredients. So he procures only malt from Germany and hops from Germany to get, some people may call it the raw. I know that that's not used so much in the beer industry, but he does believe that that is what makes the biggest difference, because these beers are mostly malt focused. So it's that malt, bready, caramely profile that comes through. And one thing to notice is that he avoids the usage of caramel malts. So caramel malts is a type of malt that uses different process of roasting. So instead of drying kilning, the wet malt, after it's sprouted, gets roasted directly, and it creates this crystally, sugary structure inside with quite complex sugars that are not necessarily broken away or eaten by the yeast. So that ends up being, or leaving a beer that has a high sugar content or perception of sweetness that doesn't necessarily go well with the style. And the last thing here is that he does not use decoction. So I don't know if you are aware of the decoction process, which is brewers will make a mash of grain and water, and they'll put it at a certain temperature. And in order to raise the temperature of that mash, they'll take out a portion, boil it on a separate pot or on a separate piece of equipment, and then that boiled portion gets added to the main one again at a higher temperature, so it elevates the temperature of the mash by a certain amount of degrees. And what that does, what that aims to do, is to activate certain enzymes or play within the temperature range of certain enzymes to create certain flavors. So the next brewer that I interviewed was Ben Brutman from Liquid State, our own Liquid State here in Ithaca. And if you are going to the Oktoberfest in Liquid State this weekend, maybe you'll get to taste some of this beer. He likes to walk that fine line between Marzen and Festbier. So, and we'll see the difference pretty soon. But the idea being that he makes a Festbier that is rather a little bit more darker in color. In terms of malts, Ben likes to approach his beer from mainly Munich malt, dark Munich, which is a more roasted type of Munich, and a tiny bit of crystal malt. So as opposed to the other brewer, Juan, who said no crystal malt, Ben adds a little bit of crystal because from his perspective, it adds certain flavor to it. From hops, Ben is not much of a purist, so he will use German hops for the most part, but if there are US cultivars of German varieties, he says that it can be included as well. And this really reflects his philosophy of making beer, which is beer first. So he likes to say that he will make a beer that stands up on its own, and then we can figure out the pairings for it, because he likes a product that you can have many of by itself, and you'll come back for it. So Ben, being vegetarian, says that a lot of these pairings are mostly meat-centric, but he likes German potato salad, grilled vegetables, and soft pretzel with his Festbier. So you can think about what does this beer that you're drinking right now has in common with those three things. And if you want to talk about it, this is the moment to bring it up while I have a sip.
A question for you, Christian. So you think, I mean, I've noticed a couple of brewers who are vegetarians. Do you think they come up with different types or styles of beers just because what they're pairing with their beer is different from someone like me who eats a lot of meat?
It's a good question. I hadn't before this experience hadn't talked about food with the brewer, and that's always been one of the niche areas that I like to attack myself, because I believe that certain beer styles really lend themselves to pair with a wide variety of foods. However, you could create really good pairings, and it is only the brewers who have kitchens that normally tackle that. And what we've seen in the industry lately is that most of them just have tap rooms, so not many brewers really tackle that aspect. All right. Sorry guys, my phone apparently likes my voice today. All right, the next person that I interviewed was Randy at Hopshire. So most of you may have seen Randy around. He's a really nice person and always willing to talk with us, and he actually cooperates with this group as well. So I went there and I didn't know that Randy doesn't tackle lager beers, but it actually ended up being a very interesting conversation, because in essence, these specialty malts that are used throughout the process of building these recipes is really the character of beers. So we're talking about Munich malt, Vienna malt, we're talking about Carafa. These are the malts that really work like the seasoning on a soup, that are the seasoning on the beer. And the base malt adds a certain backbone flavor to it, but not necessarily all of it. He mentioned that if you want to maintain a certain amount of production of beer and you want a lager, because it takes twice the amount of time to lager a beer, you have to have twice the amount of fermenters. So that is definitely a hindering factor for local brewers or small-scale brewers that want to produce lager beers. It's just the amount of time that it takes and the real estate that means in terms of money. Something that he does is that he uses this season of hop harvesting that happens to almost coincide with Oktoberfest to actually make the hops the center, the focus of the celebration. So he has previously actually celebrated Oktoberfest in his brewery, but lately what they're doing is they have local producers of hops or people from their own homes. They bring the hops to his brewery on a certain day. He buys the hops from them with beer credit, and then he makes a beer the next day, and then you can come afterwards and have the beer and pay with your beer credits from the own hops that you sold to him. So that's a very interesting approach to this. And what I want you to focus on here is that small breweries like Hopshire are really using local malts, local hops, and the idea, at least from Randy's perspective, is that beer should be local and it should be affordable. So I know this kind of detracts a little bit from the main topic, but I think that it is a very important thing, right? We have really good breweries here in Ithaca, and for those of you who are not in Ithaca right now, I hope that you do have local great breweries as well.
Out of curiosity, if you look at like his beer pricing, is it a little bit cheaper than other local breweries, or?
Yes. So one thing he mentioned is when he sells a keg of beer to a bar, he makes about $10 a gallon in that keg. When he sells a beer at his place, he'll be making about, I think, $45 per gallon. So he's able to kind of lower the price, make it a bit cheaper than the bar, and still make a better income on that. And in fact, he said he has never raised prices since he opened the brewery, like 7 years ago. So that's pretty impressive.
When I went 2 weeks ago, a full pint was $5, which is a bit cheaper than most other craft breweries around. They also do a tasting play of 5 different beers for $10, which is a really good deal, and they give you a sizable amount of beer. So definitely check it out if you're around.
Definitely recommend it. Okay, so I had a really great experience, and something very quite a teaching moment that I got from it is that, you know, beer is an agricultural product and it should be treated as such. My next interview was with Garrett Oliver, who's the head brewer of Brooklyn Brewery in Brooklyn, New York. They also have other locations, but that being the original one, I thought that would be, for the namesake, the best one to put here. I had a quite long conversation with Garrett about different ways of approaching Marzen and Festbier. But what really stuck the most was that the barley selection is super important. And this is actually a quote from him. It is super important because malts like Vienna and malts like Munich really provide a more complex flavor than the main malts that are used in the US for making beer. And what I mean by that is 2-row, 6-row are malt varieties that are normally used in craft breweries. They're a great base malt, but they lack the malty complexity that is associated with Munich. When he is designing these beers, he goes for the following objective, which is perception of sweetness and a snappy focused bitterness. What that means is that the beer is not necessarily sweet as flavor, but you do get a full perception of sweetness from certain hints on the aroma. And from his own words, your body fills in some of the blanks. So the way he described it to me was like when you add vanilla to something, or when you are having something that is rather sweet, or you associate it with sweetness, it will always taste sweet to you. So for those of you who still remember what yesterday's beer tasted like, it was rather complex in the nose. And when you had it, it suddenly like disappeared, but it also left a little bit of a trace of bitterness to it. And that's what he refers to as snappy focus. So the profile of what we call noble hops, which are some of the original hops from the Germany area, is that they're herbal, a little bit floral, a little bit spicy. But these three main areas of flavor and aroma are quite subdued. So by him saying snappy focus is that you will get that bitterness, but it just goes away. So it's quite from a point perspective instead of an area perspective. So one of the things that he talked about was the Munich malt that I mentioned already. He said you can really build an entire beer made out of Munich malt, and you will get a really good body from it and a really good color. So if you can actually tackle an Oktoberfest beer, whichever style you want to tackle, with just Munich malt and a little bit of something else to add color if you wish to do that. So it can be really more simple that we make it. One thing that he also does not do is decoction. So no multiple temperatures. And this is because nowadays we're dealing with higher modified malts. So when the malt comes from the malt houses or the maltsters, they have actually gone through several cycles of drying and roasting to convert a lot of those starches to simpler starches that can be broken down during the mash process, or that can actually be broken down further by even some of the yeasts. In terms of Festbier versus Marzen, right? He thinks that Festbier is just an intensified Helles, and it has to do also with the history of where it came from. He did mention that when Festbier came to this world as a big main beer for the Oktoberfest, it was really an agreement between breweries that sat down and said, how can we make this beer that is more drinkable? If we're selling 6 million gallons of it now, how can we get 8 million out of it? And it was really a conscious decision of making that beer gold, because golden beer, or burnished gold, or antique gold as he called it, seemed to be one of those characteristics of clean, fresh, repeatable drink. In terms of yeast, his yeast is 3470, which is a lager strain that accentuates malt. And the thing that really caught my ear the most on yeast selection for this style is that he likes to use a yeast that enhances the malt flavor, but that produces DMS, or dimethyl sulfide. So that is normally associated as an off-flavor in beer, which is that cooked corn flavor. And he says as long as it's subdued, it really adds more complexity on your nose and allows you to get a more flavorful perception when you have that first drink of it. So it's really a play on your senses in order to get fullness and then emptiness afterwards. One thing that I did like to spend a lot of time on was talking about beer and food pairings, and that is because Garrett Oliver is the author of a book called The Brewmaster's Table, which was nominated to James Beard Award. And he does mention there something about a lot of grill mates, no tomatoes unless it's sweetened, like in a pizza sauce, nothing acid. You're trying to really pair the melanoiding malt's flavor on the beer with a similar flavor on your food that carries that. It's like a bridge to one another. And that really happens with meats that have been grilled or vegetables that have been grilled. But he also mentioned things like pipián verde, which is a Mexican recipe. And another thing is to avoid things like boiled meats, because it really lacks the complexity. And then you have like a difference in flavor that doesn't really carry throughout. So I can talk a lot more about this, but why don't we just keep going into the styles now?
Can I ask a quick question here?
Sure.
So, because I'm very impressed by the number of different brewmasters you're able to talk to. So, did you know these people beforehand, or did you just like cold call them and were able to get information from them?
Both.
Oh wow, okay, very impressive.
So some of them I did know before, like Ben and Randy, the local ones. But the brew from Puerto Rico was someone that I have been following through social media because I've seen the growth of his brewery. So I decided to cold message him, if you may. And the same thing with Garrett Oliver. I've read his book a long time ago, and it really opened a different door to me in terms of food pairings because it tackles it from a marriage perspective, like they call it, which is a little bit different than other people. So I decided to just message them, and it just so happened to work.
Very cool.
And there's a little bit of a story there. I'll tell you later. So here's the logo for the BJCP. That's what I told you at the beginning. I think it was 83 or 87. It was formed. Beer Judge Certification Program. What they're aiming to do is really to set the standard for different beers. And this is not a standard for everybody to follow. This is a standard for competitions mostly. So if you're going to enter beer in competition, you're most likely going to use the BJCP definitions or something similar to actually either build your recipe, or if you already made a beer, which is what a lot of the brewers do, they make a beer first and then they look at all the descriptions of all the different styles, and whatever it fits the most, that's where they're actually going to send that beer to compete. So the BJCP has the following categories. The overall impression is really made for everybody to understand. So your friend who is not a beer geek should be able to always understand the overall impression. The next ones, which are appearance, aroma, flavor, and mouthfeel, are pretty descriptive with a lot of comparative flavors and aromas to them. So appearance will deal with the head or the foam on the beer, also the clarity and the color, the aroma on the nose. So what are you getting from it, whether it's fruity, how long does it last, what is the complexity associated with that aroma. Flavor deals more with the actual flavor in the beer, whereas mouthfeel deals with carbonation, perception of fullness or body, as we call it. And then every single style has this thing called the vital statistics. And the vital statistics is really the numeric part of it. If you're building a recipe, these are the parameters that you should be within. And this is what I call, there's actually a section in a magazine called commercial calibration. So they would use the most prominent representations of that style in the industry, and that's where they draw those numbers from. So you'll see right now that some of these beers that are sitting at 6.3%, which is pretty much the absolute maximum of a Marzen, that's what's actually the top on the BJCP description. And it is organized by colors, location, so you'll have like European lagers, European ales, German-specific brown beers or brown lagers, and then the Festbier actually falls within another category, which is in the European light lagers or golden color lagers. So here's the numbers. The first one is the SRM. So the SRM is the standard reference method. It is really a comparison chart. There's nothing else to it. Someone called Lovivon came up with a scale for this, and it was based on comparing certain colors. And then it became a bit more scientific with the SRM. There are other methods to determine color, but this is the one that I'm most familiar with and the one that is in the descriptions. So if we look at that, Marzen and Festbier really sit in two different sides of the spectrum, right? Your Festbier will go somewhere from like 2 to 5, and your Marzen will go 8 to 14. And that really is the biggest differentiator between these two styles. Other than the aroma and some of the things that we're going to be talking about, all other categories, you can see that they really overlap. For example, the IBUs, which is the International Bittering Units, you'll see that in some of the beers and the labels. It's how bitter it is, and it's actually a mathematical calculation. Some people have different methods for calculating this. Some people oppose this method actually, but it is really the best we have so far. And Marzen and Festbier really sit very close to each other, and you'll see the Marzen allows a little bit more bitterness into it. But the fact that the Marzen carries a bit more body and maltiness to it, it really can withstand that extra bitterness.
I have a question about IBUs.
Yeah.
I found that it seems like when I read labels, it's often synonymous with hoppiness. But I guess like when I'm describing a beer, I'd often like distinguish hoppiness from bitterness.
Mhm.
I was wondering if you could like, I don't know, dig into that at all. Like
Yeah.
if it's really hoppy, does it automatically get a high IBU?
So the thing with IBUs is that it really takes into account the amount of time that you boil the hops. So when you, especially during the last 5 to 7 years, we have seen a big growth of Northeast IPAs or any IPAs, which have late hop additions. So you turn off your heat, you drop all the hops in, and then when you're fermenting, you put more hops in again. So because that is not getting in contact with the beer during boil, it's really like multiplying by 0 that amount of hops, and it doesn't get taken into consideration. So there is a lot of discussion about that because some people have proven that these late hop additions actually add a lot of hoppiness. That really comes from aroma, flavor, but there is also a little bit of bitterness that comes into it by that method that is not part of the equation for IBUs.
Yeah,
Um,
if I could add a little bit more to that, I would say that yes, as Christian was saying, some hops add more to the hoppiness and the aroma, while others add more to the bitterness. So there is this distinction in the process. The ones that you add during the boiling part, well, the degree of bitterness is given by how many of the alpha acids that are present in the hops become isoalpha acids. So that determines the bitterness. While on the other hand, the hops that you add towards the end, they add more to the aroma, so like the hoppiness of it. Now that said, as Christian mentioned, there are some aroma hops that do add to the bitterness, but it's really not that much compared to the ones that were boiled.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Viviana. That was actually a great point. So from a comparison perspective, we can still see them being on the same scale almost, right? It's really that the difference in body that so far is making a difference to us. In terms of alcohol per volume, I really put a scale from 0 to 10 because most beers are within that range, right? We're not expecting a 50% beer, but they're really close to each other. They're both, I think it's a 5.8 to 6.3%. So they're in the same range. And the final one is specific gravity. So from a specific gravity perspective, what I have tried to picture here for you guys is the range from the point that you make the beer until it's fully fermented. So the BJCP actually has the initial specific gravity and the final specific gravity. What we can see here is that they're both allowed to go to the same lower end on the final gravity, or FG as they call it, and the OG or initial gravity on the Marzen tends to be higher, so it goes all the way to 1060, whereas Festbier it's really on the 1050 something. So it's not a big difference. It's what I'm trying to say here.
So does that mean since they're both around the same alcohol, does that mean that like occasionally the Marzen is fuller bodied than the Festbier, since, right? Is that kind of what those two charts say?
So your Marzen will tend to have a bit more body to it, and it will be similar in alcohol. But I think what makes the biggest difference is the usage of darker malt, because it adds a different level of sweetness or body to it. So it's that toasted breadcrumb or bread crust flavor and aroma that you don't necessarily get in the fest beer, which is more doughy.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks.
And also to add to that point, I would say the body is defined by the amount of complex carbohydrates that were not converted into fermentable sugars. So, you know, two beers that came from the same malt batch could have different bodies depending on the amount of conversion of the mash. So I think even though, yes, overall, greater alcohol leads to lower body, it does depend on how much residual complex carbohydrates add to the body or the fullness of that beer.
And remember what we talked with Glycine the other day about the yeast that we're able to actually break down further. That could really wreak havoc on a beer like this, because you're really counting on that amount of complex carbs to or sugar, sorry, to give you that fullness. So here's the actual definition from BJCP, and what I've actually taken is about a sentence from each, because they're quite long. And you can find it yourselves. There is a BJCP app that you can download to your phone, and if you want to get really judgy about it, you can go and use them at your favorite brewery. But end of the day, they define Marzen as an elegant multi-German amber lager with a clean, rich, toasty, and bready malt flavor, restrained bitterness, and a dry finish that encourages another drink. So it's really a drinkable but malty beer. Now, that is the general description. When we go into the appearance of it, and I mean, granted, I know you guys right now have the Festbier up, but think about what all of the beers that you've had throughout this week look like. So the appearance tends to be on that copper amber color. Sometimes they can get to almost brown, but not quite. And one of those characteristics that is quite defined is the presence of an off-white foam. So that foam has to be there, has to stay there for a while. In terms of aroma, the thing that comes out the most is that presence of a toasty bread crust and a bready profile to it, but no hop aroma. So think about this. You want to get some bitterness to it, but you don't really want to get hop aroma. So the way that it is defined, and remember, these are guidelines based on existing commercial beers that they have decided that they're the best representation of the style. So what they're trying to say here is this beer is sweet a little bit. It kind of washes off afterwards. It's very drinkable, but you never get hop on the aroma. When you smell it, it should just smell like toasted bread. From a flavor perspective, it gives you that initial perception of sweetness, followed by a dry perception, and then that distinctive complex maltiness. So that distinctive complex maltiness really comes from the selection of grains that we're using. Some grains and also the mash temperature will give you that ratio of simple to more complex sugars that will build up to that flavor. But also the color of those grains, the presence of certain compounds, and I'm not a chemist, so I'm not going to really delve into detail there, but certain compounds that are created in the roasting process give you that fullness. In mouthfeel, we're talking about something that is just rather smooth and creamy with medium carbonation. So the pictures that I've put here below is so I want you to think about drinking Marzen and see the resemblance between these pictures and that flavor profile, aroma profile, mouthfeel. That really toasted bread crust on the left one, the presence of darker malts. So if you like malted milkshakes, that's one of those flavors that really it's very one of those things that you will not forget easily. And the flavors of the hops should be a little bit, tiny bit botanical in terms of like herbal, flowery, and spicy. But like Garrett Oliver said, it was supposed to be something rather punctual as opposed to an entire experience of hops. So here's an example of a recipe. If you have questions, feel free to ask. I have converted many of these numbers so that it's easier to understand, but this is actually a beer that won silver medal on the 2018 National Homebrew Competition in Portland, Oregon. It competed against 273 other entries on the same category, and it came on silver. So I chose this one because it didn't have the gold one, but what I want you to look at is what they're using here. So they're using Pilsner, which is a rather lighter malt, but then they're really putting a big load of Vienna and Munich that add to the color, and a little bit of caramel Munich. So remember that some of the brewers said that they don't use caramel. Well, in this case, they added a tiny amount, 2.2%, to add a little bit more sweetness to it. In terms of naming conventions, if you're gonna go buy malt to find a specific caramel malt, some people call it caramel, some people call it crystal. And on the European market, they have different names as well. So carafa, carafoam, which is a type of caramel malt that helps with the foaminess on your beer. There's many variations. There are malts like biscuit malt that adds that biscuity flavor. There's some malts called melanoiding malts that add that more bready, toasty, melanoiding flavor to it. But in this case, they chose those four. I think the distribution is almost, almost half and half, and then some seasoning with the other ones. In terms of hops, they're sticking to Hallertau, which is a type of hop that is part of the noble hops. And I have converted the numbers here to what they call home brewing units, which means that is the percentage of alpha acids on the hop multiplied by the amount of grams that you have. And that is so that you can use it for any recipe. So if you ever want to make something like this, it's an easy way to reuse. And I can send this to you upon request. For yeast, they're using a White Labs WLP 820, which is a classical one. The mash is a simple mash, so it's what we call infusion. One temperature, leave it there for X amount of minutes until you reach that conversion. And then you just mash out with a higher temperature water to dilute those sugars and take them out. And fermentation profile is 50 degrees for 2 weeks, then they raise it. That raising temperature is used to really have the yeast kind of come up active again and eat some of what they left over, at least from a practical perspective. And then they tend to cold crash it, which means that they'll lower the temperature to have the yeast flocculate and make a clear beer. There's other methods like filtering to make it clear. Any questions on this one? I know that it's a lot of info from one slide. All right, so now why don't we open the second beer? So now you've learned everything about Marzen. Now when you taste this, give me your thoughts on it. Tell me if you think that Sam Adams that we have chosen for today, whether or not it falls within the descriptors that we have gone through.
Definitely delivers on color.
I think it's pretty spot on in terms of everything, stylistically at least.
Right. So we have the off-white head. It's relatively stable. It's pretty clear. The color definitely goes towards a copper with a reddish hue to it. On the aroma, I get definitely like toasted, kind of sweet type of bread. Maybe a little bit of fruitiness. That's just me. And definitely sweet up front. It does tend to not be a dry beer. So in this case, I do get a bit of a lingering sweetness to it. At least that's my description. Any of you care to have a different thought on it?
The one thing I would say is, I don't know if it's the way I poured it, but mine doesn't really have a head anymore. It wasn't supposed to be a persistent head.
Mm-hmm. So when I poured, I got a good amount, but by now it's really gone. And that's a good point, right? It should be a little bit more persistent, stylistically speaking. I don't know if any of you are or have followed in your life the barbecue competition world, but they're very strict about what a chicken thigh should look like when it's barbecued. And in the beer world is something similar. They stick to these rules, and the reality is you have judges going through sometimes several entries, sometimes hundreds of entries, and you want to make sure that they have a good point to refer to, so that they can say this beer is better than this one. And sometimes it comes down to 2 or 3, and they have to go very strict by the guidelines in order to be able to say which one won.
Hey, Christian.
Right? Yeah.
So I know, like in wine judging competitions, the judges will spit the wine so that they don't get drunk over the course of the day. I'm guessing it's the same for beer. Is that true?
They do that as well, especially in like national competitions. They can do that. But one of the things that they do is that they actually split it into several rounds. So sometimes they'll take like, Northeast, Southeast, and so on, break it down, then go by region, then by state, and then like take all of those entries and take them to a national level. And then that way they don't have to test 100 beers.
I've heard that some people like eat yeast to like soak up some of the alcohol. Has anyone else heard of this? Like they'll mix yeast in with yogurt.
Like bread.
No, like literal yeast. They'll like mix in yeast with yogurt and then they'll eat that before the day starts and they swear they can like drink twice as much beer.
So I heard an interview with actually the founder of Sam Adams who said that in an interview. He said when he knows that he's going to have an entire night of mingling with people around beer, he will have yeast with yogurt mixed up, eat that, and then he claims that he won't get drunk. But I don't really have any scientific nor personal proof of that.
Wouldn't it be digested though by the time it reaches your stomach, or unless you're consuming like unhealthy amounts of it?
Well, there's also a medical condition where some people eventually start growing yeast in their stomach, and when they eat carbohydrates, they get drunk. So I wouldn't think that growing yeast in your stomach would be a good thing, at least not in your gut, for lack of a better term from my end. All right, so why don't we talk now about fest beers now that you've had both? So let's think about what you just had, right? That fest beer, it was on a 4 to 7 SRM spectrum. So that really comes from a burnish gold to a slight orange, but trying to not have hues of red. And that is by their own description of it. Overall, it should be smooth, clean, pale German lager with a moderately strong malt flavor and a light hop character. So right off the bat, we notice here that there is an allowance for hoppiness on fest beer. So we're not really focusing so much on that extremely robust maltiness that disappears. Now we're really focusing more on light maltiness with some hop character. From an appearance perspective, it should be deep yellow to deep gold, should not have amber hue. So if you have some of the other one left, I would say that is pretty spot on. In terms of aroma, you still have that maltiness present, but now it's more of a toasty, doughy. And I know it looks like a weird word. It really came from their description. Toasty doughy is a thing for them. And it just means that it's not just toasted bread crust. It's more on the doughy side of things. There is also an impression of sweetness, which comes back to the same thing that we talked before. But now we do allow for that floral, herbal, spicy hop character on the nose, which we didn't allow for on the Marzen. So look at the pictures below, right? We have that quintessential golden beer that we have seen our entire lives. We have a bread loaf that is super doughy inside, like high hydration, not super dark color in the outside. So you get that almost ciabatta type of character to it. And in terms of hops, we still have the same profile, but now they're both present on the flavor and also on the aroma. So this beer is supposed to be like the lighter cousin to Marzen, but in reality it's just lighter in color with a little bit more hops. And that's why they say, and by they I mean most of the people that I interviewed, that it's borderline Helles, because it's almost like a Helles. And we can go maybe later deeper into what Helles looks like, but I think this is plenty of content for you guys. So an example recipe. This also comes from the American Homebrewers Association, which is a sister entity to the Brewers Association. And in this one, we'll see quite a almost equal distribution, if you may, of malts. Bohemian Pilsner. So Pilsner repeats itself here again. Munich and Vienna. This one has no caramel malt whatsoever, or coloring malt, if you may. But this one does have a more complex hopping schedule. We're adding hops at what I call FWH, is first wort hopping, which means that when you mash your beer and your grains and you get the wort out, before you boil, you start adding hops. That's what first wort hopping means. And then we put hops at 30 minutes, and then we put hops again in 10 minutes. So what Matthew was asking before about, which was that, where do you get that hoppiness from? How do you calculate that? Well, here we have 3 sources of that hoppiness. And here is a very classic way of making beer, which is bitterness, flavor, aroma. So the closer that you get to 60 minutes of boiling hops, you get a rather sharp bitterness to it. Between the 30 minutes to like 10 to 15 minutes range, you tend to get more of that grassy flavor from the hops. And then at the end, the aroma compounds really dominate because they don't really get boiled off. For yeast on this one, they're using a lager blend. So now it's not a pure culture of one type of lager yeast. Now they're using a blend of different lager yeasts. And keep in mind, a lot of these historical breweries, and by historical I mean like old world breweries, will have several types of yeast on their yeast banks, especially those who have the means to keep them alive. And in this case, they went for a decoction mash, or triple decoction. So take some out, boil it, put it back in, and you'll end up with oftentimes a thinner beer because you have converted more of those sugars, but also because you've done it in a step fashion, you still have some complexity to it. Some people swear by this method. Some people say it's not necessary. I'll let you be the judge of that.
I've got a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been curious. I know like AB, for example, has like a team of microbiologists that like keep their yeast strain like in good health. Like how many craft breweries would you say also have some sort of like microbiologist to manage their yeast?
Most of them don't. The investment of equipment to have like a -80-degree freezer and having all of the microbiology part and keeping it clean enough to be at a separate office within your brewery. A lot of brewers prefer to actually either reuse yeast for a certain amount of cycles, maybe running the risk of some off flavors in the long run, or some of them just buy new yeast for every single beer they make. It depends on how do they want to prioritize their cost more than anything.
Also, to add to that point, I would say, yeah, when Christian mentioned that most breweries like to reuse their yeast, it's really what's happening. So I don't have the experience of being, in the headquarters. I used to work in Ecuador for a brewery that was part of, well, it's still part of ABI. So what they did is that probably twice a month they would send us the yeast, and then I did work as a microbiologist there. So what we did is like we grew the yeast to get to larger volumes and then start different batches of beer, and we would reuse the yeast up to 7 times. So what we would do is like grow the yeast, inoculate certain batch, and then crop the yeast, kind of keep them not exactly at -80 because they were already vegetative cells, so they were already living, right, and active. So we would keep them for probably, I don't know, a day or 2 until they were ready to be pinched to the next batch, and we would do that 7 times. And sometimes 7 times can sound a lot, but if you do control a lot of things in the process, you can keep the viability around, I don't know, 97%, meaning that 97% of your cells are still in good health conditions, and they are still good enough to be pinched to the next batch.
That's really good info. I think I'm gonna have a lot of questions for you later on, actually. So a couple of years ago, I went to a conference where someone was actually tracking the genetic mutations of yeast through several cycles of reusing. And there's always the perception of either 5 or 10 times, or like Viviana said, like only 7 times. And it has become like a magical number for breweries to kind of like a hard and fast rule. But in reality, they have observed mutations quite early on. I think it was from like the 4th cycle. But the thing is that because they keep a pure culture that they go back to, they're not really reusing that part after a certain amount of batches. So you really always keep that source fresh. All right. So that said, let me just finish with this one on this slide. The fermentation schedule in here is quite similar. So they fermented at 50 degrees for 2 weeks. Then they raised up to 68 degrees for diacetyl rest, which is that part that I mentioned before. They raised the temperature for yeast to metabolize other components there. And then they cold crashed to 34 to clear up the beer. So if you're not really filtering or not using gelatin or any finings, cold crashing is a really good method for making your beer rather clear. So why don't we talk about pairings, because it's really my favorite part. So what I did for this is I tried to find pairings that have some sort of a, like I call like a bridge flavor to this beer. But I also went into several of the beers that we've had already, and I went to their websites to see what did they recommend it with, to see if there was actually some sort of a uniform idea of what they will go with. So chicken, what they meant by chicken and roast is really grilled or roasted meats, because they tend to have a certain sweetness that is associated with that Maillard reactions. Pretzels, because it's really cultural, and I think that you normally relate pretzels to this type of beer. Schnitzel and Spätzle, which you can see them on a plate together. So you tend to get that creaminess, and from the breaded and fried meat, you will get that grainy, low-level sweetness that will really pair well and carry over with your beer. Now, there are several approaches to pairing. Some people actually believe that the way that you pair is actually by contrasting flavors, so that you can have a sort of like a negative positive sort of flow to your food. But that's definitely another strategy. I think with this one, I went a little bit more traditional. Sausages, burgers, these are all on the same line as chicken and roasts. You will see that, yes, you know, your beef and your burgers will have a more what they call dark flavors, as opposed to something like veggies or chicken. But they still all carry that browning that happens on the cooking process. That is what we're trying to match in the browning of the roasting process of the malts. The Alpine cheese recommendation comes from the Brooklyn Brewery's website for their beer. And when I was thinking about this, I try to make a map in my mind about all the different cheeses that I could have this beer with. And think about this, right? You could have this maybe with a type of Swiss cheese, Gouda cheese, maybe cheddar, but you wouldn't really have it with something like a Gorgonzola, because that funkiness of the Gorgonzola will really clash with this beer. And that is the approach in here. The poutine is something that I decided to add there because it has all those different layers that are all what I would call brown flavors. And it feels like something like a match made in heaven. The roasted veggies, that is really after a conversation that I had with Ben at Liquid State and trying to look for flavors that would pair, that were not meat centric. And I think something like roasted cauliflower, something like Brussels sprouts, zucchinis, all of those flavors will go really well. And even tomatoes, even though Garrett Oliver says that that's not a great pairing for it, as long as you cook them enough so that you get them reduced and that sweetness comes through more, I think they would be great pairings for these styles of beer. And finally, desserts, right? Because I think that everybody deserves dessert, especially these days. So apple pie or strudel are really classic flavors on that arena, but you have that buttery, you have the layering of the fat and the flour together that gets roasted or baked together, and it really pairs really well with the malty profile of these beers. So that said, that's all I had for you today. But yeah, if you have questions, this is the time for you to ask them. I just want to say cheers, prost, and support your local breweries and restaurants. Tomorrow we're going to have Marzen beer. And if you want to learn about anything else specific on the beer world, just send us your recommendations and we'll be more than happy to try to accommodate them.